Hi and welcome to Lois and Morgana Davidson Art. It's Lois here today, and today I'm going to be taking a very experimental approach and painting this frozen lakeside scene inspired by this photo from Pixabay. I'll be taking, as I say, an experimental approach, trying to paint it really loosely in a sort of fairly, keeping the colours fairly close. But trying to sort of, put my own spin on it, which is what we do as painters when we interpret photographs loosely. So I'm using Millford cold-pressed watercolour paper. It's taped to my board, and my board's at an angle of about 45 degrees because I'll be using gravity to help me paint using the wet in wet technique. So the first thing is to wet the paper all over. I hope you noticed that I sort of put in a few rough pencil marks where the banks of reeds are, the distant tree line, a few kind of marks to indicate the surface of the icy lake, that sort of thing, but not too much. And then I'm thoroughly wetting my paper using a 1.5 inch Princeton Aqua Elite Mottler. You can use any wash brush, or a big flat brush is ideal for this job. Allowing the water just to sort of settle and sink in a little bit. And to start with, I'm going to apply the paint using a store card. It's a plastic store card. I've squeezed out fresh paint, raw sienna, burnt sienna, sepia and indigo onto the edge of it. And I'm using the card just to really give me this almost sort of random approach of applying the colours that I want, but just allowing them to fall on the paper as I scrape the card and sort of print the colours onto the paper, which is wet in places and slightly dry in others where I've sort of missed a few patches and where it's beginning to dry a little. So using the edge of the card across the horizon to establish that distant tree line to start with, and then this second bank of reeds. As I say, I'm not too worried as long as the paint goes on roughly in the right sort of place and orientation, and then spraying with this misting spray. And because my board's at 45 degrees, then the paint, you can see, is beginning to run down, and I can then tip and tilt my board, here turning it 90 degrees, and you can see that the paint is running across the page, and it's giving me my sort of the directionality of my flat ice surface. It's also softening out those banks of reeds or the paint that I've placed there, so that I can begin to create my interpretation or impression of those banks of reeds. Just using a 3/4 inch flat brush to encourage some of those sort of large blocks of paint to run a little bit more, giving it another spray, and hopefully you can see it's sort of beginning to take place. I call this sort of as most painters do, this mid-stage or early stage of a painting is the ugly stage. It often happens with a painting and it looks like you've completely messed it up, but actually just keep the faith, keep going, keep your vision in mind of what you want the painting to look like, and just keep working through that ugly stage or the awkward stage, and you'll be surprised at how nicely the painting will turn out. So I'm dipping with my paintbrush onto the card because there's still plenty of paint left on the card, and I've dipped mostly into the sepia and indigo here, as you can see, and I've established my tree line, and I'm putting in a few bits and bobs of darks and more of the burnt sienna into my reeds, and then taking a synthetic mop brush, it's an Escoda size 14, I'm softening out the paint so I get that lovely soft misty icy distant tree line. Stepping back every now and again to look at it, and of course if the paint is running too much, you can tip it and tilt it, or you can flatten it, or if it's not too bad like mine is, you can just sort of keep smoothing it out a bit with a flat brush. Now I've got a tiny bit of paint, sort of sepia and indigo, not too much, on my brush, and I'm just going to establish that really pale winter sky, cold and icy. So I'm quite happy with the way things have been laid out on the page. So I have laid my board flat. This means the washes won't run with gravity anymore, and they'll pretty much stay in place as they dry and soften and diffuse. I'm taking a piece of store card that I've cut up so it's got a sharp corner, and I'm dragging and scratching it through that rich red paint, which is, or orange paint from the burnt sienna, and the other colours sort of that really help to make it glow, for my beautiful foreground bank of reeds. And so I'm just putting in these marks, and these vertical marks should add a really nice texture to my banks of reeds. I really enjoy taking an experimental approach to interpreting these sorts of scenes, either from my sketchbook, from plein air, or from photographs like this one from Pixabay. And I'm just using the card now, and using the rounded corner this time to scrape a few little marks and lines through the damp paint, following my pencil lines and establishing maybe a little bit of sort of suggested perspective with shallow diagonals that come from below the tree line forward and around the reeds. And I'm hoping that just will flatten out my ice a little more and just sort of cement that illusion for me. Back to my modeler brush, my large flat, and establishing a few more darks using quite rich, thick paint. Everything is sort of slowly and gradually drying out as I paint from the wet in wet. So I have to be careful not to go in with any watery paint at this stage, otherwise I'll end up with blooms and cauliflowers. So I'm sort of working with stronger, richer paint, and then pulling the sharp corner of the card, or you could use your fingernail or the end of a paintbrush or a palette knife to pull through those extra darks, again to increase the texture of the reeds. And now I'll step away and have a cup of coffee and let it dry completely. So here it is. It's dried quite well, so I now need to just finish it off with a few finishing touches. Not too much, but just enough, hopefully, to pull this scene together. So first of all, I'm going to add a bit more burnt sienna into this mid-ground bank of reeds. I think what drew me to the photograph that I used as inspiration was the glow of red in the reeds against the cold wintry colours of the ice and the distant trees. So I'm really looking to make sure that that glow works well in the reeds. And then I can take a fine brush. This time it's a small calligraphy brush, and I'm working a bit more some dark reeds in and amongst the red reeds and the paler marks that I scraped out with the card earlier. Maybe just putting a few little dots and dashes and things to just maybe hint at sort of reed tops, flowers and sort of bulrushes, that sort of thing across the top. Nothing too much. I don't want to have any detail here, just suggestions. So in with the flat brush and just very watery mixture of indigo and sepia, and pulling across from that dark patch on the horizon line to flatten that out and straighten it a little bit. Now I'm just going to put a little bit more detail in a couple of small areas in the distant tree line. Smudge it out with my finger so I don't get any hard edges, as I'm now painting with wet paint onto a dry painting, so things won't soften and diffuse unless I help it along. And then just to get a bit more layer of colour over this distant tree just on the edge. Just darken that up a little bit more. I don't want too much detail in these trees. I just want that sort of suggestion, that sort of impression of that tree line in the misty, icy distance. Just softening back here and there. Again, that's just helping me to flatten out the landscape a bit. And then finally, I want a bit more tone underneath the reeds. So just placing in some shadow with the indigo and sepia mixture underneath both banks of reeds. Sweeping it out at a slight angle in keeping with the perspective. And I've decided to use my artistic license. I'm going to add the suggestion of a flock of birds coming in and landing on the ice. So I just touched the sky with my finger just before I started painting carefully, and that's just to double check to make sure that the sky area is completely dry, because I want my small suggested birds to sort of be quite hard-edged in the distance, small but still fairly hard-edged. I'm not going to paint them on the ice to start with. I'm going to paint them across the top of the tree line first and see how they look. Check the balance of the composition because these birds will draw the eye into the painting between those fiery banks of reeds and hopefully work to engage the viewer as a point of interest. So I'm going to have a look at it with the tape removed first, because seeing it with a clean white border helps me to see the painting with fresh eyes, almost as if it was framed, if you see what I mean. You can achieve the same sort of effect of seeing it with fresh eyes by walking away from the painting for an hour or two and then coming back and having a look at it. And so I need to just check and make sure everything's sort of as balanced as I can get it at this stage, and then just confirm where I want to put my sort of suggestions of birds on the ice. And I think just in that little pale patch below the tree line, so I'm going to bring a couple of birds across the tree line, and then just a few little dots and dashes in that pale area there. I think that's the best place for these birds to be settling, because it's distant enough that I'm hoping that the viewer will recognise that the shape of the birds in the sky is easy to read, and because then the flock of birds is dropping down towards the ice, and those little dots and dashes on the ice should hopefully now read as distant birds. Well, I think I'm nearly finished. As a first experimental go at this scene, I'm reasonably happy with it. I don't think I've done the photograph justice, but I have really enjoyed the process. I think I just need to add a bit of dry brush dark to the reeds. And so I've got quite a dry mixture of paint, and I've dabbed my brush onto a paper towel so that the paint isn't too wet, otherwise I'll get strong marks. What I want is I want just dry brush, hit and miss, skip marks, just to finish off, add texture and a bit of depth to my suggestions of reed banks. And I think that's okay. I think using brushes and the card to apply the paint has given me quite an interesting range of effects painted wet in wet. I've got some, a good range of edges. I think my flock of birds is reasonably convincing on the ice in the distance, and that sort of also pushes the distance back and creates this sort of depth and aerial perspective, hopefully. I'm also really happy with the way the wet in wet technique has produced the suggestion of shadow and light on the distant ice especially. And of course the marks on the reeds are really interesting as well. We've got a little bit of detail suggested, some hard edges, but then that lovely softness of the background. Of course, it's by no means perfect or a finished painting. It's an experiment and it's a first part of the process. I can take this and then refine the idea a bit further while still trying to keep it loose and fresh. And hopefully at some point I'll come up with a painting that I'm really pleased with. But I think this is a really good starting point for this subject. And I hope you found it helpful. If you enjoyed the video, please leave us a like, and I hope you'll consider subscribing to our channel. It's free to do, and if you click on the bell icon, you'll be notified every time we post. Morgana's got another video for you on Monday, and I'll be back again on Wednesday with another demo. So just remains for me to say happy painting, take care, and thank you so much to my wonderful Patreon group who support this channel, and I'll see you soon then. Bye.